Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the next lecture on the evolution and current trends of cultural diplomacy in Africa. What I'd like to do in this lecture is actually three main things. First of all, give you a little bit of background for those of you who weren't here for the earlier sessions. What is cultural diplomacy? What is the need for cultural diplomacy specifically in Africa? And then I want to just give one case study today regarding Rwanda, which is one of the more difficult case studies. In the next lecture, case studies in Africa, will deal with some of the more easy examples of countries that are at peace, etc., the kinds of initiatives that can be engaged. But I wanted to purposely begin with one of the more challenging today to get us really into the material. So let's begin with a brief question, what is cultural diplomacy? Now some of you may know I always refer in particular to a definition from the American political scientist Milton Cummings, who defines cultural diplomacy the following way: the exchange of ideas, information, art, and other aspects of culture among nations and their peoples to foster mutual understanding. Now, I think this definition works at the local level, the national level, as well as the international level. What I'm going to try to persuade you to believe during this lecture is that cultural diplomacy actually is needed at each of those levels. Even though in the past, let's say old school cultural diplomacy, typically was always country to country. What can the USA do in South Africa? What can Germany do in Turkey, etc.? I would argue that it's actually just as necessary, sometimes even more necessary, within a country, sometimes even within a community. So for me, this definition actually fits for each of those levels. As he says here in terms of target audience, nations and their peoples. So it's not just nation to nation. So that's why I like this definition. I think it's a flexible definition. It touches on the key points. Again, this aspect of exchange. Cultural diplomacy is always some sort of an exchange, ideally in more than one direction, between peoples, whether it's at the local, national, or international level, with the ultimate goal of fostering mutual understanding. ICD would go even further by saying, let's not stop at understanding, let's stop at trust. So really the first step is dialogue, let's get the conversation going. Second step is understanding if we're successful. Third step would be trust. Note, we're not saying consensus here. So in the sense, trust doesn't mean we agree. It doesn't even mean necessarily that we like each other, but it does mean that we trust each other. And that's really where we say that's the minimum. You know, we really need to have the trust to work together effectively in a sustainable way. So this is the definition I would offer you just to refer to for the course of this lecture, as well as the next few days. I'd be happy also to debate this with you in terms of where maybe it fits more, where it fits less. I made reference earlier to the Cold War period. During that period, this definition doesn't work so well. In the sense the Cold War really was, I would argue, propaganda, advertising, culture diplomacy. You know, those three terms were almost simultaneous. So I think Cold War period, it was less mutual understanding in both directions. You could also argue that the early forms of cultural diplomacy, let's say Alliance Française, French culture diplomacy in Africa during the 1800s, 1900s, again, was that really mutual exchange? Probably not. It was really more one culture imposing, sometimes violently, their culture on another. So again, this doesn't work perfectly across time and space, but I think it's a basic definition that we can make reference to as we discuss different cases for cultural diplomacy. The next point I'd like to make are actually four key components of culture diplomacy that I include always for our young leaders and for our students as kind of a checklist. These are four things that I would suggest you try to ask yourself when you're analyzing a case of culture diplomacy. Some of the cases we deal with today, as well as in the future lectures. First of all, I'd suggest ask yourself, what is the agenda of the culture diplomacy organization? What are they trying to do? Whether it's British Council, Goethe Institute, etc. What is their ultimate goal? Is it really to have understanding? Is it to promote the interests of their country? That's the first thing we have to try to get clarity. What is the agenda? What is their goal? Secondly, we have to get clarity, who is the agent? Is it a non-governmental organization? Is it a governmental organization? Is it for-profit? Is it non-for-profit? What are their, let's say, agendas also as an agent? Not always an easy thing to find out. You have many cases where you have technically non-governmental organizations that in some cases are totally funded from one government, in other cases majority funded from one government. One example of that would be Deutsche Welle TV, the big international TV broadcaster from Germany, technically a non-governmental organization, but totally funded from the German government. What do we make of that? Is it governmental or not? British Council is similar. Just over half of the budget of the British Council comes from the British government. However, they also claim to be non-governmental. So again, this is not as easy as it may seem to really get clarity who is the agent. Thirdly, what is the vehicle of cultural diplomacy that they're doing? Are they sending jazz musicians as a cultural exchange? How? Or sort of what is the method of the cultural diplomacy? And the final point I'd encourage you to get clarity is target audience. Who are they reaching out to? Is it preaching to the choir? Is it bringing the typical elites that always go to these events? Or is it really touching citizens, whether that be firefighters, high school teachers, nurses? And I think their target audience, we've seen a vast array of different target audiences that in some cases are spoken to, in other cases ignored. So I think that's, again, very important. If we're going to have successful cultural diplomacy, we have to make sure we're reaching out in the right places. So that's kind of my checklist of sort of the 4 key points that I always try to figure out myself when assessing a particular example of cultural diplomacy. And what I'd like to do now is offer you just a few different forms of cultural diplomacy that we've observed at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy throughout, let's say, the centuries. And it's actually 2 basic forms, and then I have sort of a twist with the second form with 2 variations. The first form of cultural diplomacy, as we categorize it, I call positive or classical cultural diplomacy. By classical, I mean sort of the old school, or sort of the original forms of official cultural diplomacy. By positive, what I mean there is initiatives that actually support some sort of cultural exchange, so that actually make it easier for us to access some sort of culture. This will be in contrast to what I define later as negative cultural diplomacy, when a policy makes it more difficult to actually access a culture, like quotas on the radio, etc. But first of all, let's talk about these positive classical forms. I'm purposely giving you an outline here of some of the most famous examples. Right now, all, actually European and Asian. We'll come to the other examples later, in particular Africa, etc., particular our case studies on Africa lecture, but I want to start now with the beginnings in terms of where this official form began. Very briefly, in 1883 was the beginning of the Alliance Française. This is technically the oldest official form of cultural diplomacy. I would argue, as I do in the recent book I did with Professor Jessica Genau-Hecht, Searching for a Cultural Diplomacy, that cultural diplomacy is actually much older. It didn't begin with governments. It didn't begin in 1883. It began much longer, really when the first, let's say, humans moved outside of their home community into another home community, whether it was as voyagers, as pilgrims, as any different form of movement. I would argue that, in essence, was the beginnings of cultural diplomacy. All of us, by being here in the seminar, are actually practicing cultural diplomacy. Everything you say or don't say, everything you express or don't express, is actually an expression of who you are. So in that sense, in the broadest form, I would say cultural diplomacy is nothing new. I would argue it began really in this people-to-people form a long time ago. Then I would say there was an interruption in that timeline where government said, hey, this is a good way for us to promote our agendas. Let's take charge of cultural diplomacy and let's use it to actually move our political agendas forward. And I'm being a little provocative the way I explain this on purpose. But basically, since 1883, you see a number of governmental forms where, again, governments say, hey, this is part of our public diplomacy, part of us explaining our foreign policy abroad, winning the hearts and minds of foreign audiences, getting others to like us. And in particular, you then see with Professor Joseph Nye, this balancing of hard power and soft power. Many of you may know Professor Joseph Nye is a professor at Harvard University who coined this term soft power. And if you're not familiar with that term, very briefly what that means, hard power is getting what you want through coercion, either threatening someone with violence, for example, or actually using violence to get what you want. So hard power, really by coercion. The other way of getting what you want is soft power, as Joseph Nye says, which is the power of attraction, getting others to want to work with you, whether it's because they like you, they trust you, or they have similar goals and values. Now, those are the 2 basic forms of power, according to Joseph Nye. So cultural diplomacy in this positive classical sense, for the most part, up until, let's say, end of the century, was actually about soft power. It was about governments trying to attract using culture for a very clear purpose, usually linked to a political agenda. So Alliance Française is a very similar format to, let's say, British Council and Goethe Institute. The idea, you're probably familiar with these institutions. There's one just around the corner of ICD. It's a physical building, and the idea is in that building, you're actually trying to represent different facets of your culture. So at the Académie, or the Alliance Française, sometimes in some countries it's called Institut Français, they do many things. Here in Berlin, there's the Cinéma de Paris, where they show French movies. They have exhibitions where they show French artwork, French photo exhibitions, etc. They do lectures, they have famous authors, poets will come. So really, in every way, trying to represent French culture here in Berlin. They also offer French language courses, so you can learn French there. So again, this is more or less, let's say, a positive phenomenon where resources are taken and actually invested to bring a culture abroad. So let's make it easier for Berliners to get to know French culture. More or less is what's going on here. We can go deeper into this in a second. British Council, I would argue, is more or less the same thing. British Council began in 1934, and again, a physical building representing British culture abroad. In the question and answer period, I'm happy to go more in depth. British Council has undergone a number of evolutions, in particular in the last 6 to 7 years. But briefly put, British Council, again, same format. Let's bring our culture abroad to make it easier for others to access. Goethe Institute, more or less the same format. Started in 1951. Goethe Institute, in many ways, I think, was a response to the Second World War, where the Germans said, hey, we need to do more to try to build bridges, to build trust. British Council, I would argue, was more or less a response to the First World War, where the British were saying, look, something is not working in this international system. We need another institution to try to help. And that's something we can also go into more detail later, about sort of this call and response, how actually very often political situations and catastrophes, such as world wars, can also actually inspire culture diplomacy institutions to be born. So I'm going briefly now, because again, it's a fairly simple example. We'll get to some more complex examples soon. That would be one format for positive culture diplomacy. Alliance Française, British Council, Goethe Institute. A second format for positive culture diplomacy would be Deutsche Welle. Deutsche Welle is the fourth largest international TV broadcaster in the world. You have CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and then Deutsche Welle. So it's a huge, let's say, media institution. TV is offered in 4, if not 5 languages. Radio is offered in 30, I think it's maybe even up to 31 languages. Internet they also have in 30 or 31 languages. What's interesting about Deutsche Welle, as I said, governmentally funded. However, it's not broadcast in Germany. So Germans don't watch Deutsche Welle. It's only broadcast outside of Germany. So their target audience is outside of Germany. I would say the world is their target audience, as well as, let's say, Germans traveling abroad who want to see German news. Their agenda is a little bit tricky. I've had many conversations with the presidents of Deutsche Welle TV, who I know, Christoph Lanz. He's also told me openly, their mandate isn't propaganda. On the other hand, his mandate is to show more of the good things of Germany than the negative things. And I won't say they're a biased media and they have a propaganda agenda, but he was saying you do notice that in terms of also the kinds of articles that you see on Deutsche Welle. You don't have as many stories about integration challenges in Kreuzberg. You have more stories about design or literature or the fine arts in Germany. So again, this is a model that we need to also carefully analyze. What do we make of this? Technically non-governmental, but it's governmentally funded, broadcast around the world, has a little bit of a slant. Is it truly a trusted, neutral news source? I don't know. I don't want to criticize it, because I think they really do a very good job. Some of their journalists and moderators are also on the advisory board of ICD. In many ways, you really have a great professionalism with Deutsche Welle. And in some parts of the world, they're very neutral compared to the alternatives. So it really depends place to place. But for me, that model is something that I think could be optimized somehow. Maybe if they broadcast Deutsche Welle in Germany, maybe if they diversified the funding, I don't know. But those are some of the challenges that I see with that particular model for positive culture diplomacy, again, to bring German news or bring these German narratives around the world through TV, internet, and radio. The final example, Japan Foundation, similar in some ways to the Goethe Institute and the other models. What's unique about the Japanese case, I'd encourage you also to read this chapter in, again, my recent book, Searching for a Culture Diplomacy. We have actually 2 chapters looking at Japan. What's interesting about Japan in the 70s, they started from scratch cultural diplomacy. Before that, they didn't do any. They also started from scratch civil society. Before that, they didn't have a civil society. Essentially a top-down approach where the government said, okay, we should have a civil society, we should have a culture diplomacy. To generalize, I'll say the characteristics that make the Japanese Foundation unique. It's fairly elitist in the sense it's very targeted. They bring really very small groups of actually individuals together, journalists, academics, politicians, really trying to influence multipliers as opposed to mass society. And they don't really have the same backing from citizens in civil society that other NGOs do that really started as a citizen-to-citizen basis, similar to, let's say, ICD, or the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy, where really it was a very grassroots initiative. We started with nothing, step by step, 1 volunteer, 2 volunteers. That, I think, brings a certain sustainability factor to an organization that Japan Foundation didn't really have the same way. It was more of a top-down approach. And why that's relevant is I think that's also part of the reason why, in my opinion, they're a little bit more elitist, a little bit more closed, as opposed to, for example, Confucius Institute, which is now the fastest growing culture diplomacy organization in the world. We'll get into Confucius Institute also in the lecture on case studies. of cultural diplomacy in Africa. But Confucius Institute, as you may know, they now have, I think, 386 Confucius Institutes in the world. They want to build 1,000, and they're trying to get everybody to go and learn Chinese. And in many ways, I would argue also there's a political agenda behind that. So this is my brief summary of the term I wanted to explain to you, positive classical cultural diplomacy. So essentially, governments or institutions actively supporting some sort of a cultural exchange to make it easier in some way to access their cultures abroad. I'll leave it at that. It's a simplified definition. Obviously, there's more to it than that. There are governmental agendas, but in essence, that's how I would define positive classical cultural diplomacy. Negative classical cultural diplomacy, I'll give two quick examples. Académie Française, you may know, is an institution in Paris that does many things. However, one of their tasks is to maintain the purity of the French language. So actually, they're responsible for blocking influences, so to make sure that English words, etc., don't corrupt the French language. If there's a new word, such as email, don't call it an email, let's make up another word. They called it courrier, or courrier électronique. Again, it was important for them that there was a French equivalent instead of using this English word. Again, some would say this is a great example of a culture really being proud of its language and protecting its language. Many also have the opinion, as do I, language is an essential part of identity. If a language gets lost, I think some part of your identity also gets lost. So I can respect the idea behind Académie Française. I question, however, is this really efficient in today's globalized world? Should every country be investing money to block, the sort of free flow of words and language? I don't know. But that would be one example of, let's say, negative classical cultural diplomacy, where a government or an institution is trying to block or protect something, so actually to make it more difficult for certain exchanges to take place. Second example, which is a better example, quotas on the radio. Many of you may know for a long time, the French government has actually said, look, we've got to go in there and intervene. If we don't limit how much American music, how much foreign music is on the radio, we're not going to have French music anymore. And in a strong way, the French government has actually legally mandated it with laws where there's penalties. I mean, it's a crime if you're a radio station and you don't follow these mandates, limiting how much of the music in the French radio can be in other languages. When I was there back in 97, 98 studying, I think it was up to even 60%, if not 70% of the music. It was a big number. Now it's down. I think it's maybe 30 to 40%. It depends on the time of day. It depends on the kind of music. So it's a complicated scheme. But the principle remains that actually the government sees it as part of their role to actually intervene and really block and say, look, we've got to limit this. I have mixed feelings with that too. On the one hand, fine. Basically we have an issue right now of this cultural imperialism, as the French say, of the United States, which in many ways does actually steamroll local cultures, and it makes it hard for a local film director to compete, let's say, with the almighty Hollywood. So I can understand, all right, let's give these people a chance. It's not just survival of the fittest, the biggest culture wins, but these kinds of quotas can help, I think, to protect local cultures. On the other hand, again, my heart is sort of, in essence, averse to these kinds of governmental controls. I think protectionism, as we all know, doesn't really work sustainably in economics. So I also don't think it would really work sustainably when it comes to culture. I think there's got to be more creativity out there when it comes to culture than just protecting or blocking or limiting. The provocative example I gave also in an earlier talk to the young leaders was comparing, let's say, Latvia and France. Latvia is a fairly poor European Union country, doesn't have so many resources for culture. Does it really make sense for them now to start spending all kinds of money, making it more difficult for Latvians to access other parts of European culture, to make it more difficult for Latvians to have access to whether it's French music, German music, Spanish music? I don't know. My hunch, my inner feeling is, look, we should be making it easier for Latvians to get more connected. We should be making it easier for Latvians to get more exposed to foreign languages, not the opposite, blocking, limiting. So I'd love to debate this with you as well, but this is again what I'm proposing, negative cultural diplomacy. You could also substitute this by saying negative cultural policy. It's sort of, I'm using these two words a little bit interchangeably. Sort of the cultural policy of France in many ways is one about protectionism and limiting and also subsidizing their own industry to help, let's say, protect it and promote it in light of the globalization that is taking place around it. So this is a second option that we have as cultural diplomats. And again, this is something we can apply to Africa if we want. This is an option in the toolkit, so to speak. The final example that I want to give you is what I call new school cultural diplomacy. And here I'm in many ways influenced by a classmate of mine in college, Lauryn Hill, a very famous singer. You may have heard of Lauryn Hill, of course, from the Fugees. She's very famous. She also had her own album. Before she dropped out of Columbia University in her second year, she started an NGO there called the Refugee Project. And Lauryn's thesis, or the way she really saw the world, is that the main challenge or the main dividing force in the world between humans was not race or nationality or gender or ethnicity or any of the other categories we typically think of, but it was access. Some people in the world have access to what they want and what they need. Some people don't have access. And that was the filter she used to really classify the problems of the world. And I think she's right. As we know, there are enough resources in the world. There is enough food in the world. There is enough peace in the world. There is enough democracy in the world, if that's what we want. The question really is access. And that should actually be the job of local, national, and international governments to actually assure that access. And that would be also, I would share her opinion in terms of how I see the problems of the world, or the challenges. I don't like to use the word problem. Cultural diplomacy, I think you could look at the same way. I think the task of new school cultural diplomacy today isn't to persuade or to say Nigerian identity is like this, or German identity is like this, or South African identity is like this, but rather to just facilitate access. Let's create more opportunities for people to get to know Nigeria. Let's create more opportunities for people to get to know South Africa. Let's create more opportunities for Ethiopians to get to know Germany, for Ethiopians to get to know Botswana, etc. So for me, facilitating access is actually the main goal that I would argue of the new school cultural diplomacy. One specific example, again, since we're sitting in Berlin right now in Germany, is a German example, the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, the German Academic Exchange Service. Similar to many other exchange programs in the world, the reason I'm picking on this one, as far as I know, today it is still the largest nationally funded academic exchange program in the world. Erasmus is bigger, but there you have 27 countries for the European Union funding it. This is one country where Germany says, look, this is really important, and they said it already in 1925. Let's make it easier for foreigners to access education in Germany. Let's make it easier for Germans to actually have academic opportunities abroad. And they bring about 70 to 80,000 foreigners back and forth every year. What I like about it, and why I'm calling it New School Cultural Diplomacy, all they're doing is facilitating access. You pick your professors, you pick your classes, you pick your topics. You can make friends with Germans, you can make enemies with Germans, you can like the country, you can dislike the country, and then you go home. And I think that seems to me really the perfect model for cultural diplomacy. Don't influence, don't tell people what to think, don't even try to, but just allow them the opportunity to make up their own minds. And I think in the end, you're going to build much more trust that way than trying to give certain images, whether it's nation branding or persuasion, etc. So that's why I'm calling, even though this started in 1925 in Germany, New School Cultural Diplomacy as a model. If we say, okay, the new forms of cultural diplomacy really should help to make it easier for us to access each other, not make it more difficult. ICD I include here as well because that's very much our own vision. Really what we're doing with this conference, with the courses that we do, etc., bring people together who normally wouldn't come together, try to give them access to each other, give them access to hopefully really interesting speakers and provocative speakers, and also give them access to the resources that they need with the follow-up projects to hopefully actually implement further cultural diplomacy in the future. Let me give you one specific example, an African example, of what I would consider new school cultural diplomacy from a famous organization, Right to Play. And the young leaders who are seeing this will remember this film.
My name is Tracy. I work for an organization called Right to Play. Today we're in Inyaka Island. It's about a 2-hour boat ride from the capital city of Mozambique, Maputo. Here on the island they're quite secluded, and before we came they did not have physical education in any of the schools. So what we've done is train a lot of the high school students and students who are finished school, and they have gone back into the schools and tried to implement before and after classes a form of physical education. Today we're kicking off the 2-week festival to celebrate the Mozambican Day of Women. It's actually a national holiday. It's a really important day to Mozambicans. Boys have a lot more spare time, we find. Their parents are a lot more likely to allow them to come and participate in football or just play before or after school. We generally find that girls have more responsibilities at the home. At a much earlier age, they might stop school and become part of the household chores and such, as opposed to staying in school where they can have an opportunity to participate in Right to Play games. So today we're trying to have a festival with equal opportunity for children to play, both girls and boys. Right to Play can help with gender issues in a community, is just to empower the girls to become bigger players in the development of the community.
So what I find interesting about this example, so here you can see they're trying to actually tackle gender issues with the game. This is what I would consider an example of indirect culture diplomacy, as I refer to in the slide. Indirect culture diplomacy for me means accomplishing your goal indirectly. So if your goal is to bring, I don't know, Israelis and Palestinians together, do so through joint activity as opposed to an initiative about Israelis and Palestinians. There's the famous example of street football world, some of you will remember, where again it's a matter of getting Israelis and Palestinians together to play soccer. The same thing applies here in this example, right to play. They're getting people together to play games, have after-school sports, physical education, and indirectly they can accomplish other goals, such as reconciliation, as we'll see in the case of Rwanda in a little bit, such as in this case gender equality, such as other issues. And I think that's a very interesting form, especially in conflict areas or also post-conflict areas, how one can indirectly maybe bring people together in a way that directly sometimes is impossible. So that would be, again, one component that I would argue should be part of New School culture diplomacy. So first of all, it's about partnership, public sector, private sector, and civil society. It's no longer just governments anymore. The main goal of New School culture diplomacy, facilitate access between cultures, between peoples. And then in addition, this option of also indirectly accomplishing the goals as opposed to directly. So those would be the main components of what I call New School culture diplomacy. I have a little chart here as well as a recap for some of the students here. The future model for culture diplomacy, partnership between public sector, private sector, and civil society. The benefit I would see of partnership, so if we can get the Mozambique governments together with an NGO in Mozambique, together with a company, a private sector company in Mozambique, we're going to be more free from agenda. If it's only a governmental initiative, there's the risk that maybe we'll be more linked to the governmental agenda. If it's only a private sector initiative, maybe it's the risk that this company is just going to try to earn and increase their profits off of it. If it's a partnership between different sectors, you're less likely to be dominated by one of those agendas. The second step of this is, of course, to take it to an international level. Let's say we have country A and country B. Let's get all of the sectors involved in one country and all of the sectors in the other country. And again, it's easier. It's harder for people to say, oh, this is Mozambican propaganda, this is German propaganda. If you have partners, creating this and hosting this on both sides, you're going to be more neutral. I think you're going to have better authenticity and also the recognition in the communities where you're working, I would argue would be better because you're a little bit more at arm's length from the different agendas that could possibly be at play. So that would be what I would propose really as a model for the New School culture diplomacy and something for us to think about when it comes to Africa. So this so far was really just theory. It's a recap for some of the students here who have been studying this. But I wanted to begin with that as we now talk about Africa, because there are many different forms of culture diplomacy, as you saw, that we could consider applying to Africa. And the first question is why? In the sense, is there a need for culture diplomacy in Africa? And then the second question, if we agree there could be a benefit for more culture diplomacy in Africa, how? And that's where I want to give one case study today of a challenging case of Rwanda. And then in the next lecture, case studies, I'll give at least, 6, if not 10 other examples. But let's begin first of all with the need for culture diplomacy in Africa. Is there a need for culture diplomacy? If so, what? The first challenge that I see regarding Africa, or sort of an opportunity for culture diplomacy, is this discrepancy between the political map of Africa and the cultural map of Africa. So this is just the basic political map there. As we all know, the political map really does not represent the diversity of the cultural map of Africa. And for obvious reasons, the colonial period, etc., groups were put together that didn't necessarily fit, that didn't necessarily belong. So that would be the first, that's a need for culture diplomacy that I would see within Africa, that one tries to have initiatives within African countries, within African cities, to really, first of all, recognize, respect, and pay tribute to the vast diversity of cultures that are there. And then secondly, to try to foster dialogue, understanding, and trust between those communities, which very often don't get the chance due to political barriers and all kinds of other factors. So that would be the first opportunity where I would say there's a need for culture diplomacy, just looking at the political map and recognizing that it really doesn't fit so well to the cultural map. So within Africa, African countries and communities. The second place where I would see a big need for cultural diplomacy in Africa is when we look at the diaspora. As I mentioned earlier, the African diaspora technically is larger in numbers than the population of the African continent. Typically has many more resources, many more opportunities than your average African citizen. And again, I'm speaking about Africa as if it's one continent. I recognize obviously it's not. But statistically, I'm just trying to illustrate the potential that the diaspora has. This would be a second opportunity that I would see for cultural diplomacy if one could try try to have cultural diplomacy initiatives, first of all, within the diaspora, to try to say, all right, just within the United Kingdom alone, or within the United States alone, or Germany alone, let's get our act together here first, really getting more partnerships, getting more solidarity, really, as a group. As a second step, to try to have increased opportunities for the diaspora, not just to send money through Western Union every week back to the African countries, but really to work in a cooperative way in partnership between the diaspora communities as well as the African communities. This does happen to a good degree in some countries, other countries not at all. So I think there's certainly a potential for more. And I would love to see more cultural diplomacy initiatives dealing with this issue of the diaspora and also the continents. The third opportunity that I see is that strengthened cultural bridges can lead to strengthened economic bridges. There's this problem I also referred to earlier of how African countries very often are perceived abroad. Also a challenge how they're presented, and sometimes how they're presenting themselves abroad, and the reality of those African countries. Very often each of those things can be completely different. The reality of the country may be one thing, it may be perceived another way, and it may be presented another way. This is an opportunity for cultural diplomacy. If cultural diplomacy can help bridge the gap between the way a country is perceived, the way it's presented, and the reality, I would argue it's going to be more attractive then for trade, for investment. Again, my thesis is that Africa needs trade, not aid. And if we're serious about saying, all right, if we agree that Africa does need trade and Africa does need investment, then we have to see how we can somehow work with the many, let's say, stereotypes that are there to try to counter those stereotypes. Supplement partial information, correct misinformation, to allow people to see more fully the opportunities and the chances that are there. So this would be a third opportunity where I think cultural diplomacy can really help the way that African countries are viewed abroad and the way they're presented abroad, and ultimately lead to not only more cultural bridges, but I think also more economic bridges. And I think the better job we can do at really representing these vastly diverse identities abroad, I think the easier it will be to have also economic bridges. And the one can definitely counter the other, or can definitely help the other, support the other. So those are, from my opportunity, just as an outsider looking in, three opportunities where I think cultural diplomacy could help. Will it revolutionize the situation? Will it work in every case? No. But I think there certainly is a potential for increasing and strengthening those relationships. And that in itself can help politically, economically, and culturally. The next point I'd like to make is to just differentiate for you three different kinds of relationships that require three different strategies for cultural diplomacy. This is true in Africa, this is true around the world. The first category of relationship is if you have two countries that are at peace, two countries that cooperate well. That's, of course, the easiest situation. We could say Germany and the United States, Germany and France, or many countries also within Africa, where they're at peace right now and they cooperate well. There you need a different kind of cultural diplomacy, and I think there the cultural diplomacy is more how do we maintain our relations, how do we strengthen our relations. There's the famous quote I often refer to from our advisory board member, Alexander Langolius, who's head of the German organization, the Checkpoint Charlie Foundation, during German-American exchange. And he says, Mark, friendships are not like light switches that you could turn on and off when you need them. You have to send at least a Christmas card once a year. And his thesis is that the United States has been forgetting for a long time to send their Christmas cards to Germany because they really pulled back culturally. I would argue, again, on the African continent and beyond, one does need to have some sort of a regular exchange, even in good relations. We can't take our friends for granted. We can't take our partners for granted. So let's say even within the African Union, for example, it would be a great potential for this kind of work. So that would be the first category, relations between countries or groups within Africa where you have a good relationship. Second category, relations in the context of conflict. This is something that I have a lot of respect for and initially was very pessimistic about. What can cultural diplomacy really do if you have a conflict? If people are trying to stay alive, if people are trying to eat, what space is there really to talk about cultural diplomacy? And I feel ashamed that, initially I kind of gave up and I said, okay, first we have to wait for that conflict to be over and then we can see maybe what we can do. But obviously that seems too easy, and I think there are opportunities such as Right to Play, organizations such as Street Football World can show that even in conflict situations, it is possible to bring people together who normally wouldn't come together. It's more difficult, and it involves a lot of measures, sometimes even having the encounters take place outside of the country where the conflict is taking place. But I think something can be done. So for me, it's not enough just to give up and say, okay, there's a conflict, let's leave it, and just rely on hard power to solve the problems. I think things can be done there. So that's the second area where I think indirect cultural diplomacy is maybe the way to go. So don't bring the two groups together who are fighting and expect them to present their identity and the other identity and hold hands in peace, but bring them together to do something else, whether it's to build a homeless shelter, to volunteer, to play soccer, whatever that joint initiative is, then it'll be easier, because the goal is the joint initiative, something that they want to do. Indirectly, okay, they've got to somehow deal with these other individuals who maybe officially they're having conflicts with. It can work, and I've seen a number of examples where it has worked. So that would be the second case, which again, a very difficult case, but we have to differentiate when you have groups in conflict. The third case would be post-conflict situations, and there Rwanda or South Africa would be a great example, where there was a conflict, and then after the conflict, one of the main goals was reconciliation. How does one really build trust and build understanding after so many wounds have really been incurred on both sides? And I think it's a very difficult thing, and I think it requires a very special kind of cultural diplomacy. You can't just expect academic exchange automatically to heal these wounds. I think it takes openness, it takes also humility, and it takes also forgiveness, which are very difficult things to expect, especially after a conflict has just taken place. And that's as we discuss cultural diplomacy and human rights, etc., where these kinds of open, honest discussions can really have an impact. We'll see that in particular soon in my example on Rwanda. But I just wanted to first clarify, we can't group all of these relationships into one. There's at least three main categories that I would suggest we look at when we deal with cultural diplomacy and these different relationships. And I think we really have to handle each relationship very special. Mozambique's relationship to South Africa is different than Mozambique's relationship to Morocco, which is different than Mozambique's relationship to Portugal. And I think we have to realize each one of those relationships will probably need its own form of cultural diplomacy, responding to different needs and also taking advantage of different opportunities. So again, a very important point, especially when talking about cultural diplomacy in Africa. So those are sort of the three forms that I wanted to discuss. To conclude, I want to zero in for a moment on Rwanda, which is in many ways a very challenging example to see cultural diplomacy. On the other hand, you could see it as actually a great success story, where in many ways, obviously the battle's not over now in terms of all problems being solved, but tremendous progress has really been seen in Rwanda. So let's look in particular at the situation of Rwanda, why it's unique, and also how, in many ways, cultural diplomacy has already done a lot, and how it can continue to maybe heal wounds and actually form new forms of reconciliation. So first of all, I don't think we need to go into tremendous detail about the history. I'm sure we're all aware of the genocide, 1994. Very briefly though, the small landlocked country in Central Africa had never received a lot of foreign attention until the day that a plane crash in the capital city, Kigali, became the starting point for one of the most severe genocides in human history. What happened in Rwanda between the April 6th and July 19th, 1994, changed the demographic landscape of the region forever. The decades of Hutu and Tutsi rivalry in Rwanda culminated in a mass killing of the Tutsi minority in the country, where within 3 months, more than 800,000 people were killed, and more than 2 million people were displaced within the country, or were driven to gigantic refugee camps in Rwanda's neighboring countries. So again, I think we're all aware of the tremendous tragedies that took place. What do you do in a situation like that? How does one even conceive, something as difficult as reconciliation after something so extreme happened in such a short period of time? Let's say the priorities for post-conflict reconstruction were more or less the following. First of all, I think Rwanda realized they needed to have a holistic approach to peace building. It couldn't just be one or two things done fragmented. One of the priorities, building a culture of inclusiveness, really to create the Rwandan identity. It doesn't matter, which group you're maybe from, we're Rwandan, and trying to really create the sense of identity, which in many ways had been lost. Secondly, establish institutions that promote unity and reconciliation. Thirdly, of course, rule of law and good governance, transparently. Ensuring equal rights and opportunities at all levels, education, jobs, social services, and power sharing. And we know this is a challenge in many African countries where it's totally not equal and you have the one tribe competing against the other. Repatriation and resettlement of refugees and reestablishment of trust in society. Security, return of property, adoption of children, creation of the Gacaca courts, which we'll go into detail in a moment. Promotion of gender equality and fight against all sorts of discrimination, and employing various conflict resolution methods for promotion and peace and reconciliation, such as popular consultation, research, citizen empowerment, etc. These were some of the main priorities that were on the table when we really began this reconciliation process in Rwanda. Primary agents of cultural diplomacy at the time were the National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, the UNHCR, including a number of different NGOs, and the Rwandan government. Their agenda was essentially promote unity, peace building, forgiveness, understanding the political issues dividing since the colonization, and the values of culture and the value of culture. Encouraging Rwandans to leave the asylum around the world, especially in neighborhood countries, and indoctrination in post-conflict. The vehicles they used are the methods: disarmament, reconstruction, transparency, therapy, developments, promotion of education, modernization of education, reintroducing Rwandan traditions into society. Their target audience, on the one hand, was everyone, but in particular, Rwandan refugees, ex-soldiers from the preceding government, ex-FAR, especially child soldiers, Rwandan youth, women, especially survivors of the genocide, students in the context of universities, police, etc. So actually a huge target audience. Really, they wanted to influence everyone. How do you do it? The first reason why I think we've seen the success that we've seen in Rwanda is the example of the Gacaca, the special kind of tribal court, which I think really was crucial in terms of allowing the reconciliation to take place and laying the foundation that allowed cultural diplomacy to take place. Here you can see a few photos of what these courts would look like. The epicenter of post-genocide Rwandan society and politics has been the need for reconciliation to assuage the ethnic tensions and end the culture of impunity. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda has yet to meet its goal of reconciliation in Rwanda. The failure of the tribunal goes beyond its institutional shortcomings and can be attributed to the norms of international criminal law and rendered an inappropriate response to criminalizing mass violence. The Gacaca courts were resurrected in Rwanda as an indigenous form of restorative justice. The principles and processes of these courts hope to mitigate the failures of Arusha justice and at the tribunal and seeks to punish and reintegrate over 100,000 genocide suspects. Its restorative foundations require that suspects will be tried and judged by neighbors in their community. And this is a quote taken from 2003, just as this process had been beginning. But that was the essential idea, to try to allow this reconciliation and healing and justice to take place at a very local level, at a very grassroots level, where you're actually sitting there in front of your peers discussing these issues, which are, of course, very painful issues to even discuss at all, let alone in a public setting in your community. The agents of cultural diplomacy in this case, if we see this Gacaca court as a form of cultural diplomacy, which in many ways I do, the judges of the courts were called, and my pronunciation is of course terrible, but Inyangamuagayo. They're men and women elected by the population according to their level of integrity. Their agenda: eradicate the culture of impunity, disclose the truth on the genocide events, speed up genocide trials, reconciliate and strengthen unity amongst Rwandans, prove the Rwandan society's capacity to solve its own problems, collaboration between the inhabitants in disclosing the truth on the genocide events. The Gacaca processes helped the victims of genocide to know where the bodies of their relatives were thrown so that they can bury them with dignity. Again, a major step. It sounds probably hard for us to imagine, those of us who have never really experienced violence of this nature, but these things are very, very important. I mean, just to be able to locate, your loved ones and give them the proper respectful burial that they deserve. So all of this was done openly in the public space, transparently, in the context of the Gacaca courts. Vehicle of the Gacaca, as I said, disarmament, reconstruction, transparency, therapy, developments, promote and educate modernization of the entire society, and reintroducing Rwandan traditions into society. So not bringing, let's say, Western values, but really looking back to their own roots and taking their own values and bringing those back to the forefront. Of course, the best examples of those traditions is what they were looking for. Target audience here, primarily planners, organizers, instigators, supervisors of the genocide, leaders at the national, provincial, or district level, within political parties, army, religious denominations, and militia, people who committed rape and acts of sex, genocide survivors, victims, observers of crimes in the genocide, were the main groups they were trying to address. In my opinion, the success of the Gacaca process relies on the following. First of all, active participation of the population. 85% of Rwandans participated in these courts. Very, very impressive. I mean, if you look at voting results in the United States or in Germany, very impressive statistic, and I think that was crucial. This was not a small group, this was not an elite group, this was really the vast majority of Rwandan citizens were involved. That's, I think, one of the most important things. Secondly, involvement of administrative and religious authorities and civil society in the process. It wasn't just politicians talking to politicians, it wasn't just lawyers dealing with lawyers, it was really a cross-section of society. Also, general satisfaction of the population after the first Gacaca verdicts and the results gotten from data collection proceedings. So in the sense it got off to a good start, people could see this is something that actually can bring justice and can actually function. And that inspired and made it easier afterwards. adhesion of the majority of suspects in prisons and in the community to the procedure of confession, guilt plea, repentance, and apologies. So the point is it actually worked, and in many ways they were able to get a lot of the apologies that were necessary. Justice is, of course, a very difficult thing. How can one have justice after a genocide? But I think to a large degree, Rwandans really are satisfied with the way that this worked, and I think that they feel in many ways that really justice was served in the vast majority of cases. This, I would argue, was the main reason why cultural diplomacy was possible in Rwanda after the genocide. I would also argue that these courts themselves, in some way, maybe we can also see as an example of cultural diplomacy, really bringing people together for a common purpose in total humility and total transparency to try to deal with something as painful and as difficult to deal with as a genocide. And this allowed for many things, and I'll just give you a few examples now to illustrate a few examples of indirect cultural diplomacy. And in the case studies lecture, I want to go more into depth with a lot of examples. But today is really more the theory part in terms of giving you the outline. So one example where indirect cultural diplomacy then became possible was in the general field of gender and education. There's an organization called the Forum for African Women Educationalists, Rwanda chapter, which is a larger African organization. This is just the Rwanda chapter. Non-profit making, non-political, non-governmental voluntary organization that brings together all Rwandans interested in promoting girls and women's education. It is one chapter of the larger Pan-African organization FAWE, founded in 1992 by African women and educational ministers. So here's again an example of indirect cultural diplomacy. Because this initial reconciliation was possible in the courts, you can then get to work. So let's bring all Rwandans together to talk about girls and girls' education. It doesn't matter what culture, it doesn't matter what tribe, the focus here is girls. And in many ways, as we know, Rwanda is really a leader. Just a few statistics, these are even out of date now. October 2003, by that point, women won 48.8% of the seats in Rwanda's lower house of parliament. Now I think it's even up to 80%. I don't know if anyone has the statistics, but there are a lot of women in the Rwandan parliament. Ministry of Gender and Women in Development first established a national system of women's councils shortly after the genocide, and their role has since been expanded. Education passed in higher education on 3% to 60% nowadays, and secondary and primary school 70%. So in many ways, really, Rwandans got together, they had that reconciliation take place, and they got to work. So I would argue these would be forums. This is just one example of an NGO, but there are many more working for educational opportunities as well as women's rights. So that's one example of, again, let's say a cultural diplomacy initiative that took place after the reconciliation process, for the most part, had succeeded. A second example, again, indirect cultural diplomacy. This is actually an American cultural diplomacy initiative, primarily by USAID. The Rwanda Media Strengthening Program promotes the sustainability of Rwandan media outlets, the professionalism of Rwandan media community, and the capacity of media associations to provide services to their members and effectively engage the governments and public in their interested members. The project is part of USAID-funded Millennium Challenge Corporation Threshold program to advance more professional and sustainable media sector, contributing to enhanced media interdependence, more open governments, a greater voice for civic groups, and improved access to public information. Of course, the issue of the media is a crucial issue when it comes to also a country rebuilding. You need to have transparency, you need to have neutrality in the media, and I think that's why the Americans also invested in this particular form of cultural diplomacy. And again, it's not about Hutu or Tutsi, it's about Rwandans, and really let's get together as professionals and focus on the media. And I think that's also why it worked. Again, it's an indirect form of cultural diplomacy. And in doing this and doing a training program as a journalist, etc., of course, you have many opportunities to then have reconciliation, understanding, and trust with your fellow Rwandans. Today, there are many examples of cultural diplomacy. Some of them I will go into detail in the case studies lecture on cultural diplomacy in Africa. But just again to give you a flavor of the things that then you see. Street football world using sports as a vehicle for cultural diplomacy. Right to Play also using sports as a vehicle for cultural diplomacy. Confucius Institute, which we'll go in the next lecture, a fascinating example of how the Chinese have actually really succeeded to have a great reputation in Rwanda because they're giving educational opportunities to Rwandans. They're giving them Chinese classes, they're giving them scholarships to universities, etc., and that's really well received. Really, Rwandans say, hey, the Chinese are coming and they're actually giving us something we need. Goethe Institute, Deutsches Museum in Rwanda, Centre Culturel Franco-Rwandais, the public affairs section of the U.S. Embassy, as I mentioned, is very active, Rwandan Cinema Center, FESPAD, which is a international music exchange festival. Sport and cultural diplomacy in Rwanda, as I mentioned before, two big examples. And the Rwandese diaspora are also having a very big role. So those are some of the actors that are now emerging and really working together with Rwandans of all sorts from all regions of Rwanda, in many ways in success. So I think what's interesting about Rwanda is you have, again, one of the most challenging situations for culture diplomacy after a conflict, when you have such a difficult past, people who don't necessarily want to work together, people who don't trust each other, people who have a lot of, let's say, baggage, that they're carrying with them when they enter a room to be together with someone who's from the other side. It seems almost inconceivable, but I tried to explain to you why I think it was able to work in Rwanda, and I think we can take some lessons from there and maybe apply it in other post-conflict situations in the world as they emerge. So to conclude, today I really wanted to give you an outline for, let's say, this evolution that I've seen in culture diplomacy from something primarily governmental to something that in the end, I would argue, really lays more in the hands of citizens. And in particular, my recommendation was the partnership, of course, between the different sectors. And let's say trends in cultural diplomacy in Africa where I've observed the biggest need. So today, where I think really, today actually, immediately, we could start making a difference and actually an improvement in the broader African situation. First of all, as I mentioned, in dealing with this discrepancy between the political map of Africa and the cultural map, to really get more of a questioning, more of a discussion going also within African communities. What is our identity? What does it mean to be Ethiopian? What does it mean to be Nigerian? I think many Germans can't answer that question. What does it mean to be German? Me as an American, it's also very difficult. What is American identity? I don't know. But I think it's a very healthy process to actually have that questioning going on. What is it really that matters in the end? Is it our passport that determines who we are, or is it something more than that? And I think the more clarity we can get, first of all, within the African cultures on that is a good thing. Secondly, of course, the more clarity we can get in the international community, so that the international community can also understand these identities, then it's the best case scenario. Secondly, this almost untapped potential of the African diaspora worldwide. And the reason I say almost untapped, I know there's a lot of activity between the diaspora and Africa. I mentioned Western Union as one example. But there are, of course, many examples where the African diaspora is very, very engaged. But typically, as I said, it's unilateral. I help my family in my country, and that's it. You help your family in your country, and that's it. And I think the potential is if we can actually somehow step out of the box and say, okay, it's not only me, it's not only my family, it's not only my village, it's not only my tribe, but actually maybe I should also think of my neighbor, whether it's a neighbor in another tribe in the same country or a neighbor in another country in Africa. If we can somehow, in that sort of more selfless way, think also, what can I do for my neighbor? Then it starts getting interesting. Then I think there's a big power that the African diaspora could have. And there I would argue it really is untapped. I have not seen, I'd be happy if you have examples, really where the African diaspora is effectively working together as a group, either in the Pan-African sense of the word or another sense. So there again, without being critical, I think there in a positive way, I would say there's a huge potential. We could be doing much more as an African diaspora, working together as well as with the continents. And then finally, to conclude, I would say really this connection between strengthening the cultural bridges, which can also lead to strengthened economic bridges. There we can also, in the discussion, I'm happy to discuss the issue of tourism with you. Tourism is a really important part of many of the African economies. How can one also have a tourism strategy that's more in sync with cultural diplomacy, so that it's not just people going in, relaxing at the beach and leaving, but when they go, they can actually also have some sort of a cultural experience, and not a fake cultural experience where people put on the old costumes of centuries ago, but a real experience. So we can really get to know also, let's say, the innovative, dynamic culture of Mozambique today, for example. So there, I think there's a huge opportunity for linking these two things, the economic bridges and the cultural bridges, whether it's in terms of tourism or culturally diplomatic tourism, or whether it's in the form of just helping this issue of stereotypes. The cultural diplomacy can maybe change the way that certain African countries are presented in the world, certain African countries are perceived in the world, fix situations where you have misinformation, supplement situations where you have partial information, therefore allowing more economic bridges to come, more trade, more investment, and then you'll have much less dependency on aid. And this rise of Africa, in many ways, can actually come, in the sense not outside people just giving money and helping out, but really Africa itself moving forward and empowering itself by creating, step by step, more and more economic bridges with itself, actually, within the African Union, the continent itself, and also with its partners around the world. So those are three areas, I'm sure there are many more, but those are three areas where I can see really a huge potential, where we could do much more when it comes to cultural diplomacy. I'd be very happy to hear your feedback, your questions, and also have some discussion and debate. If you agree, if you think there is actually a potential that cultural diplomacy could do more in cultural diplomacy. I'd also love to hear from you maybe even critical remarks where you say, you know what, cultural diplomacy really wouldn't work here, or cultural diplomacy could make things worse here, or cultural diplomacy done in this way could actually backfire. Because I don't think cultural diplomacy is the end-all solution. I think it can also be a bad thing. It can also be a negative thing. It really depends who's doing it, who is the agent, and what is their intention. And are they successful? Because sometimes you can have very good intentions, but actually do more harm than good. So I'm not saying cultural diplomacy is always a good thing. I think it can backfire, and I think in some cases it's more appropriate than others. That was why I was trying to differentiate for you also the different kinds of relationships that we're dealing with. And if you take the recipe from one relationship and put it on a different one, you could actually have more problems than good. So we do have to recognize the limits of cultural diplomacy and also the possible risks. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be very happy now to engage in discussion and feedback with all of you on all of these issues. I'm hoping we don't agree on everything and we can really get a good debate on a variety of issues. So thank you very much. And I'll come here. And the floor is yours. So what I would say, since we don't all know each other yet, if you could...